Sorry, I'm just moving the microphone there. Hello, everyone. We're going to have a little bit more of a serious and kind of, I wouldn't say scripted, but more disciplined stream. Because for much of today, I've been reading, not just on the current crisis with the riots, but also into the way that these riots have been provoked. And a lot of this is, of course, things that are very much relevant. For example, you can't say that the murder of George Floyd wasn't a murder. But there's a lot of very, very interesting stuff behind it that a lot of people don't really know. Now, perhaps in this end of the internet, it's going to be more common to know about these sorts of things. But I do think it's very necessary to talk about them. So we're going to be discussing today mass manipulation of the Western mind that's been going on for over 100 years. In fact, the first instance that I can think of was actually psyching the American public to go to war during the First World War. Now, before we properly start, I'm going to give you a sort of reading list. Now, I'm going to recommend that you share this, because this is a very, very important stream. Like, there was the one, of course, on Gnosis. There's, of course, the other one on the books. But this is extremely important. So, to start, I'll introduce the books that I will be discussing. There is, and this is the really important work here, there is Crystallizing Public Opinion by Edward Bernays. And this is about any kind of public relations. This has dominated politics for 100 years. Another one is a book that I have gone over before in some detail, and that is Gnostic America, a reading of contemporary American culture and religion according to Christianity's oldest heresy. So we will start there and explain what we're going to explain, because we're going to be talking a little bit about mass media brainwashing. Because it's very interesting, and every single person here, to some extent, is under the influence of it. And it's not even necessarily a bad thing. It's who uses it. Now, first of all, we're going to talk about how Gnostic America ties in. The author, Peter M. Burfiend, did some reading of Aristotle. Now, I'm going to say this is Burfiend's view, because my philosophy of mind isn't that sharp, and he sums it up in this. Now, his view of the mind is that we in the world hear things, and our body receives the physical, the physical phenomena. So, like, someone flaps their lips, they receive the movement of the waves, the sound waves into their ears. And then something called the spirit converts these waves into what's called a phantasm. And this is understood by the immaterial human mind, the soul. Now, this is very interesting, because it means that we have a subjective experience of every single word. I could utter a word like logos, and it would mean something very different to Heraclitus than it would to St. John the Apostle. The syllables are the same, the frequency is the same, etc., but they have different connotations because the phantasm is different. The spirit is changing that. And this leads to an attachment to phantasms as opposed to reality. And this is entirely unavoidable just because of how the human brain works. It also leads to the potential to manipulate people. For instance, one person can read the Douay-Rheims version of the Bible and come out with an entirely orthodox view, or a Baptist could read it and come with an entirely different interpretation, based on how they're interpreting the words, based on the phantasms that are in their mind. When I say Jesus to a Protestant, and then I say Jesus to an atheist, they're going to think two radically different things. Enter mass manipulation. And enter Bernays. And to a lesser extent, another man called Walter Lippmann. All public relations and all public opinion management originates in the changing of these phantasms, or the installation of new phantasms. They call them stereotypes. In fact, the use of the word stereotype comes from Lippmann, Walter Lippmann. It wasn't used in English for the connotation that most of us use it today, until it was introduced by a PR guru. And simply put, a stereotype, a phantasm, to a lesser extent, I suppose it's a form of phantasm, is an uncritical fact about the world that is just accepted, or at least the fact or the reality that wants to be conveyed by the particular person. So this could be something entirely false. This could be something entirely true, like the creed. You know, I could say, I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, right? Those would be the sort of stereotypes and axioms, the uncritical truths that are passed on about something. But it could also be a lie. Like, you know, there will be a proletarian paradise where everyone will be equal. And some of these PR gurus genuinely believe that and push that. Now, public relations, long term, is effectively about instilling these phantasms and instilling these stereotypes in such a way that it guides the people to make actions and to choose things. Good example of this. Interesting how in the 1960s all of these rock bands popped up, and how all of these previously very, very controversial and unaccepted practices were pushed. For example, transcendental meditation by the Beatles. Now, this, of course, wasn't... I'm not saying that this was a deliberate choice. I don't know enough about it to say it's a deliberate choice. But the result of that mass pushing of transcendental meditation, set it off as a movement. Because the Beatles inculcated it through their behaviour, and people imitated it. But also other things like, imagine there's no heaven, it's easy if you try. And then you have the background music opening people up, because it's very calm, very sweet, to the point where you don't really pay so much attention to the implications of the lyrics, but you accept the song as it is because it's good to the ear. Now, public relations is about implanting these in and then letting them play themselves out in the way you want. It's essentially programming people. Now, this is where it gets very disgusting, and the main reason I had to put down Edward Bernays' book, because Edward Bernays was related to Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was his second uncle or something like that. Or second uncle twice removed or something like that. I can't remember the exact one. But suffice to say, Bernays and Freud both had the same antipathy for religion. The difference between Freud and Bernays is that Bernays was supremely more effective. Because Freud, he had his strange theories. He used to fiddle around with his member. He used to believe everything was, Oedipus complex or whatever. Bernays was different. Bernays understood that he could inculcate people. And this also involved the destruction of religion, because the thing with religion is that it encourages simplicity and self-control. And that makes it a lot harder to control people, because if you have instilled virtues such as these, first of all, it's a lot harder to sell somebody on something. Secondly, it means you're going to get resistance when you try to control someone. And thirdly, this rising away from the emotions enables somebody to more objectively look at the picture. So, Bernays, or at least those using his techniques, I don't know for certain if Bernays used these. They deliberately waged war on the American people, and by extension the Western people, by instilling stereotypes which contradicted religion. Not always in the most obvious sense either. Of course you have things like the song by John Lennon, Imagine No Heaven, which is very, very direct. But it's often a lot more subtle than that. For example, isn't it very interesting how Christ went from being a king in the eyes of the Protestant denominations as well as the Catholic and Orthodox ones, to being this kind of squidgy friend or spiritual guide. That's one of the ways that it was pushed. And of course, when Christ is reduced from God to just a spirit guide, or something akin to that, then people aren't going to feel quite so much of an obligation. Now, of course, it goes far more, much deeper than this. It includes redefining terms like racism. It includes redefining terms like truth. I mean, you know, you see this a lot with students at universities, right? Because they're taught something called critical theory, which specifically applies to this, right? You know, how we can have subjective truth, how you can have your truth and I can have my truth, right? It's a redefinition of truth. Of course, in the classical view, truth is just the thought in the mind and expressed with the tongue corresponding to reality. Nowadays, it's something far more interior. You can simultaneously be biologically female, but also be a man. There's a disconnect between mind and body. And this podcast here isn't supposed to agree or disagree with that, in so much as it's supposed to point that out. Because I appreciate that there's many people here who disagree with the Aristotelian view of gender. And my point here isn't to support for or against, it's more to let people know where this all came from. Now, before I get into the political examples of this, because there are a multitude of examples on both sides of the political spectrum which show this kind of behaviour, I want to talk about how religious people can protect it. Now, Catholics are in a very privileged position. We have imprimaturs and nihil obstats on books. And these are essentially affirmations from archbishops and abbots and people in authority that say the book can essentially be read. Imprimatur is essentially a stamp of approval. And nihil obstat says there's nothing contrary to faith and morals, if I recall correctly. So if you're choosing a book when you're a Catholic, if you just go by the nihil obstats and the imprimaturs, you'll be pretty well protected. Likewise, although it's very outdated, you also have access to the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, which is an index of explicitly outlawed books. Now, this isn't good for modern books, which isn't so bad because most modern books are really awful. But it's very useful for protecting you against older books, which I think you should be reading anyway because they tend to be of a greater level of substance than the modern ones. So, for example, there's a it's on the index. Let me give you an example of something on the index. Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That's on the index because it, frankly, spreads falsehoods about Christianity, and Gibbon was somebody who was virulently anti-Catholic and virulently anti-Christian. Likewise, I believe René Descartes is on there as well because his view of the duality of mind and body kind of breaks a lot of things and leads to a very strange version of Christianity. Now, this isn't in force. It used to be in force under the pain of mortal sin until Vatican II. And now this isn't the case, but it still has moral binding force. Which, and don't quote me here, I may well be wrong. Which means it doesn't bind under sin, as far as I understand. But if a bishop wishes to, they can enforce it. I wouldn't... don't take my word for it, though. Because I don't actually know. This is just what I've been told. But I would still use it as a guide, and I would use that to avoid bad books, as well as reading books with imprimaturs would suggest, they're good books. Now, when it comes to film, it's a bit more difficult, but they don't tend to leave much to the imagination. Although, one movie that's very surprising in its subversion is Saving Private Ryan. Burfiend actually talks about this in his book. it's not really about serving the nation. It's not really about that, although that's given lip service. But for those who have watched Saving Private Ryan, remember the first scene where they're on the beach. How bitter it is, you know. Tom Hanks is on the transporter, and you know the soldier behind him vomits, and they're all getting ready, and then boom, and everything's blurry, and the banality and meaninglessness of war comes out. And it's an incredibly well shot and very effective scene. I actually really like this movie. But it reduces the titanic struggle of the Second World War, which is something that was expressed in older films in a very patriotic manner, to something that's about meaninglessness and ultimately more about an almost unobtainable aim in the act of saving Private Ryan as opposed to the war itself. It almost makes death meaningless, like when Vin Diesel dies at the very beginning. It's entirely for a meaningless reason. He goes out to go and save a guy who's been shot. No, he gets shot at random, and then he just bleeds out very, very slowly, like tears in the rain. Right? It's a movie that's completely devoid of patriotism, and that's very intentional because, of course, Spielberg was trying to tell an erotic story about the pursuing of a goal, which is to a certain extent forlorn. Okay. Some people talking about the Jesuits in the chat. We will take a quick break to take questions, and then we'll go on to the politics, because we're not only going to look at the right-wing examples of this, because they are most certainly present, and they should not be ignored. I am apolitical, but also the left wing, which is, quite frankly, a lot more egregious and a lot more immoral. So I'll be taking questions now if you want to tag me. I'm sure there's already a few sitting here in the chat. We've got 50 viewers. If you want to spread it to other people, please do. Lots of people talking about BLM. Are you in the UK? Well, I mean, guess by my accent. List of 36 books. I'm going to release that at some point. Probably. Is that St. Anthony in the video image? Yes, that's the Temptations of St. Anthony. I chose it deliberately because because essentially it's all erotic temptation. When Burfeen talks about it, he refers to the phantasms and the manipulation of phantasms, which, of course, Bernays refers to as stereotypes. He refers to them as erotic bonds because he's talking about it in the context of previous occult movements. So, for example, another person who's on the index, Giordano Bruno, he talks about. Okay. So, Mongoose Man says, "Oh, can I read Gibbons?" Well, I wouldn't. It's also not very good history either. What do you think of Archbishop Vigano? Well, believing in QAnon is a strange thing. I'm going to withhold my opinion on Vigano, but yeah, I'm going to withhold my opinion. I don't think it's prudent to say it. So, the right-wing example, and believe me, when I name this, I am going to deliberately use the politically correct term because I don't want to get flagged. Not because I'm like afraid of the term or anything. And that is the Islamic grooming gang scandal. Now, if you were to believe the likes of The Rebel, or you were to believe the likes of Breitbart, and these people aren't above this, you would be convinced that there's being some sort of religiously motivated jihad against British girls. And while it is true that the majority of the girls who were grievously sinned against were done in by people with ethnicities pertaining to this, it was not a religious issue. It was an issue of, frankly, degenerates. Because what they won't tell you is that there are a lot of white gangs doing the same thing. They won't tell you about the gypsies who do the same thing. It's just... It's not just. It's an element of underclass culture that is unfortunately very pronounced in this time of moral decay. And Pakistanis are not in any way reduced in their role in that. And by virtue of the reason that the Pakistanis were imported, they're imported as low-skilled labour. They have a tendency to be in these communities more often, so they're going to perpetuate this kind of degeneracy a lot more. Now, there were a couple of religiously motivated groups, but the vast majority of them were common criminals operating with, like, to a lesser extent, white. There are obviously white people involved with these gangs, but the gypsies did similar things. That they won't tell you that. It's not racially motivated necessarily, it's coom. It's coom and domination of neighbourhoods. It's not religious for most of them. Actually, I'm just going to quickly go across the room to grab my water. So I'm going to stick my things out while I talk. There we go. And a lot of people are going to get very angry at me saying that, because they bought the meme. But that's the reality. And a lot of people fell for the meme to the point where they gave Tommy Robinson, of all people, their financial support. In fact, the truth is that the Muslims are not in a position to enforce some sort of Islamic theocracy in Britain. They are being degenerated just as much as the white communities. In fact, go to any university and you'll see this from experience. I'll put it that way. Now, the bigger example is, of course, Black Lives Matter. Now, the statement Black Lives Matter is an objectively moral one. It's objectively true that Black Lives Matter, obviously, is there a systemic racism problem in America? Interesting thing about that term, there's a lot more to it than people think, because when you hear systemic racism, you think, oh, is there racism in the systems in the US, meaning the hatred of other races, which would be yes. But the trouble is that systemic racism means a lot more than that, because of critical race theory, right? And that's something that people simultaneously pay attention to and ignore. Because you have a majority of people who would get absolutely disgusted if you said there wasn't systemic racism in the US police force. Because they assume that you mean, you're denying the fact that there are racist police officers, which there clearly are. There are enough policemen in the US to make that an almost certainty. But what they don't realise, and perhaps there are some ideologues who would legitimately scream at you for not accepting the connotations of that term. If I recall correctly, systemically racist means just inherently racist in most of these people's views. So are the police inherently racist? If you hold that, that's the reason to abolish them, and that's why so many people are calling for the abolishment of police. Are the police forces in themselves inherently racist? Obviously not. There's nothing to the reality of police that inherently makes them racist. Obviously. But let's go through the About page. Because as though I've kind of illustrated this with when I've talked about the term systemic racism, but it's even more apparent with the Black Lives Matter thing. One second, I'm going to see if I've... Okay, I'm going to drag it across actually to the stream. Is it this one? No. Okay. Sorry, I'm failing to drag it across because I am a boomer. No, I just have to close the other window. My apologies. No, I want that separate. You know what? I think it's because they're different accounts. Give me a second. I'll just... There we go. Right, can you all see it? I think you can all see it. Yeah, I think you can all see it. So let's go through the page. This is the wrong page, actually. What we believe, that's my mistake. I'm making a lot of mistakes here. So let's go through the page and see what we find, because I think some of the contents of the Black Lives Matter page are very surprising. Now, do Black Lives Matter, as I've said, obviously. Very, very obviously. It's disgusting what happened to George Floyd, and that should stop. And as we see from the beginning of the Black Lives Matter page, Black Lives Matter began as a call to action in response to state-sanctioned violence and anti-black racism. Yes, both bad things. Our intention from the very beginning was to connect black people from all over the world who have a shared desire for justice to act together in their communities. The impetus for that commitment was, and still is, the rampant and deliberate violence inflicted on us by the state. Now, it's very interesting how they say the state. I'm going to pop the chat out so I can see it alongside the thing, so I can actually respond to you at the same time as I talk. So it's very interesting how they use the term just state. But for the moment, there's nothing particularly wrong with that. Enraged by the death of Trayvon Martin and subsequent acquittal of the killer George Zimmerman, that was a while ago, and inspired a 31-day takeover of the Florida state capitol by Power U and the Dream Defenders, we took to the streets. A year later, we sent out together on Black Lives Matter Freedom Ride to Ferguson in search of justice for Mike Brown and all of those who have been torn apart by state-sanctioned violence and anti-black racism. And as I've said, I'm not going to pass any particular judgment on the cases involved, because I'm not American. Forever changed, we returned home to begin building the infrastructure of Black Lives Matter Global Network, which, even in its infancy, has become a political home for many. Interesting how that turned out. Ferguson helped catalyse a movement which we all helped give life. Organisers who call this network home have ousted anti-black politicians, won critical legislation to benefit black lives, and changed the terms of the debate on blackness around the world. Now, blackness is one of these funky terms. I want to point that out right here, but aside from that, fine. And if you take blackness to refer just as that pertaining to African Americans, then that's fine. Although it doesn't actually mean that. Through movement and relationship building, we have also helped catalyse other movements and shifted cultures with an eye towards the dangerous impacts of anti-blackness. These are the results of our collective efforts. The Black Lives Matter Global Network is as powerful as it is because of our membership, our partners, our supporters, our staff, and you. Our continued commitment to liberation, another thing, another funky term, for all black people means that we are continuing the work of our ancestors and fighting for our collective freedom because it is our duty. Fair enough if we just take everything at face value, but as we know with critical race theory, nothing is face value. And that will become very clear. Now, we're going to skip a little bit. We're unapologetically black in our position. Whatever, fine. This is where it gets interesting. We are guided by the fact that all Black Lives Matter, regardless of actual or perceived sexual identity, gender expression, economic status, ability, disability, religious beliefs or disbeliefs, immigration status or location. Now, like I say, the average person is going to find this fine. But there are a lot of implications here that come from critical race theory, which, interestingly enough, like one of the leaders who is funded by a foundation established by a pro-segregationalist politician, there's more to it. There's always more to it. Like, for example, we are self-reflexive and do the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege. such as, and uplift black trans folk, especially black trans women who continue to be disproportionately impacted by trans antagonistic violence. Fair enough. Disgusting that the violence happens, but if it's trans antagonistic violence, then it's clearly something not related to race. So it kind of seems outside the remit of just saying Black Lives Matter, which you would expect would be a primarily racial conscious focus group. We build a space that affirms black women and is free from sexism, misogyny, and environments in which men are centred. Again, perhaps reasonable in the modern view. Related to race? Not necessarily. Let's skip down a little bit. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and, quote, villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children. To the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable, we foster a queer-affirming network. Where we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather, the belief that all in the world are heterosexual, unless he or they disclose otherwise. We cultivate an intergenerational communal network free from ageism. We believe that all people, regardless of age, show up with the capacity to lead and learn. Now, again, maybe reasonable. But if we take this in context, and we consider all of these things working in unison, what they're essentially proposing is the substantial weakening of the black community. Now, how does this work? Well, I, for one, believe very strongly in extended families. I think that the nuclear family structure is a meme. But then, at the same time, you're getting rid of ageism. There's no respect for elders. So, you've essentially given the youth license to overrule their own parents. So, if we have this extended structure, that would require a very strong patriarch or matriarch over a number of different descendant families, and within those nodes as well. So you've essentially just given permission for anybody to do exactly what they want, and so therefore you've completely undermined the centrality and authority within the family. Now, what does this lead to? People pinging off in every other direction. Likewise, the mentioning of sexuality at all, which, frankly, I don't understand why anyone would necessarily have to identify with that. I think that it's a waste of time, and you could define yourself by so many other things. The fact that you've placed the sexuality first implies that there's going to be a lot of carnality going on, and I think we all know that. I think we all know that the modern world works that way. So you've got a lot of people hyped up on sexuality who are given license not to listen to their elders, and are in a framework such that the locus of control is further away from them than in the nuclear family, and an explicit undermining of that as well. So, what's the result of this? The destruction of the black community. Because if you get rid of the ability for black people to sustain their families, then they can't group together and do actual group action. You can protest against racism all you like, and that would be a legitimate thing to do. Like, it's a legitimate thing. Like, when these people are gone after, like, these conservatives that pretend it's not happening, it's a lie. When, say, what's her name? The not America First woman, Turning Point USA woman, right? When she gets up and she says, all these horrible things about George Floyd, it's distraction. It's a lie. He was murdered. And people should stand up to that, right? That's fine. But you've just provided a framework which long term is going to destroy any community cohesion, because nobody can trust each other. There's no explicit authority beyond might makes right. And might makes right requires tyrants, and tyrants don't last very long. In fact, people talk a lot about gang violence, but it kills people phenomenally early. It kills people at half their years. They live scarcely half their years according to the Psalms, right? And it causes terror, but it also leads to constant absences of control, and it leads to widespread degeneration when you've got that kind of tyrannical leadership. So what Black Lives Matter here, the organisation, Candace Owens, that's the one. What Black Lives Matter has essentially done is that in the process of, I presume, honestly and sincerely seeking to end racism, which is a laudable cause, they've just gone and destroyed their entire... what they're advocating here would destroy their entire community. I think a much more healthy approach would be something like what Malcolm X proposed, where there were stable families, and blacks built their own businesses and were economically self-sufficient. And that's the answer to the question that Mastery Eagle has just asked. So what happens to white, Hispanic, Asian families under BLM? Well, they're not an organisation that intends to rule the entirety of the American state. They're interested in black problems, and so they're going to do that. At least from my own reckoning. So we're going to get rid of the window capture. And we're going to answer questions now. So let's see. Let's see questions, guys. Because I'm sure there's a lot of questions. Aren't they explicitly Marxist? Well, I would guess so. They sound very Marxian. Or at least Marxist inspired. No one is a true serious Marxist like Marx was now. These people have disappeared. They're mostly the descendant from people like Theodore Adorno. And from the post-structuralists who took influence, right? Right. Nico King says it kind of sounds like the Black Panther Party. No. The Black Panthers at least have, from what I understand, an emphasis on family. Yeah, like what this group here is essentially advocating for is that there becomes a completely disordered soup, and that's not good for anybody because it's just going to lead to endless chaos and no power whatsoever. But then again, people aren't critically thinking about this. Black lives do matter. So we're going to take questions now. I'm just waiting for the... yeah, there we go. The stream's kind of caught up now. Right. Is BLM led by black nationalists or black leftists? From what I know, the Black Lives Matter organization is led by black leftists. Specifically the kind that have adapted white ideas, strangely enough. Like all these people, they claim to, believe in all of these things, but then they go ahead and they study post-structuralist frameworks written by French people, and then they apply it to their end of things. So, for example, like I say, Patrice Kahn-Coolers, who's one of the people who led it, she's a Fulbright scholar, and Fulbright was a pro-segregation senator. Now, he's been dead for 25 years, and I don't doubt that somebody else has taken care of that foundation. But I do find it extremely interesting that she's getting funding from people who were originally in favour of some very inhuman laws. Okay, so let's see questions. Quake asks, why do you regard the nuclear family as a meme? Because human beings have got to focus on other things. Most husbands, most wives need a break sometimes. But the children still need someone to teach them and look after them. If you have the grandparents, not only if you've got good grandparents involved, they love children and love seeing their grandkids right in close proximity, but it also gives you a chance to throw them onto the grandkids so the mother and father can enjoy their own company alone, or they can go and do their own thing or whatever. You can't constantly belabor the attention of a man. Not to mention the fact it's a lot more structured and a lot more strong. Because if you have, say you've got an extended family with one grandparent and grandmother, and then you've got 3 sons, each of them married. If one of those sons has a problem with their wife, then the other people in the family can either impose pressure for people to sort out their issues or help mediate in arguments. With the nuclear family, that's not possible, because you only have the mother and father. And finally, it gives a sort of community spirit where people think that they aren't just doing things for the sake of their own children or whatever, they're doing it for a lot more people than just that. Nico King asks, do you think... Oh, by the way, like I say, ask questions, guys. Do you think that Joe Biden's going to win the 2020 election because of the riots? No. No, I think that the riots... I actually saw a poll. 58% of Americans want Trump to go ahead and deploy the National Guard. Now, if he's winning in those... in terms of proportional representation when it comes to that, right? And we continue seeing the destruction of small business. Apparently, 30 to 40% of black-owned businesses have been destroyed in the mixture of the pandemic and in the looting. Right? For every single one of those destroyed businesses, you're going to gain a bunch of Trump voters. Because they know that Joe Biden's not going to do anything. At least if they're reasonable. Now, do I think Trump would be a good president? No. Frankly, I don't like him. I don't like the way he's behaving. I think he's very, very intelligent, though. But Joe Biden, you know, like, pooing himself on... He's not really that appealing to black people. If he goes on a stream and he says to black people, you know, if you don't vote for me, you're not black, like, who are you to say that, Joe? You're white. For a start. And then you've got Trump saying he's going to enforce the law. And he will probably enforce the law in a couple of days. And these people are clearly antinomian and burning down businesses. I think it's very clear who they're going to support. I would bet that over 70% of the black community would be directly against 95% of BLM's ideas. If they knew, obviously they know that their lives matter, right? Obviously, because they're in the likeness and image of God. That's something that is often forgotten, and I think it's gross. And it's often forgotten by the conservatives as well, you know, those neoliberals that hide behind... you know, liberal principles of everyone being equal. Like, they pretend to be colourblind, right? Like, you're denying a part of a human being when you do that. And that's gross. You're denying an aspect of someone, right? But at the same time, they're not going to be advocating for even more destruction of the family. You see the reaction out of a lot of, like, black men to this as well. They idolise people like Malcolm X. A lot of them are very keen on Louis Farrakhan, right? They're keen on MLK because these were strong, dignified men who did good things. And they were in favour of the strengthening of their communities in actual ways. And there aren't really that many of them about now, which is quite sad. But they champion that. They champion, you know, the desire to build up their communities again. And so I don't think they would be in favour of BLM's idea. Like, interesting how they don't mention fathers, right? Neko King asks, have you heard of Dr. Steve Turley? If you have, what do you think? I've heard of him. But I don't really have much of an opinion. Because I haven't really watched him. I've seen a lot of people share his videos, but I haven't watched him. John Nathan says, do you think that people on the right should first understand leftist philosophy and then write a critique on their philosophy, or should the right strive for organisation and action? The latter, definitely, because I've attempted to sit down and read leftist philosophy, but the entire thing is just gibberish. There's no sense reading, say, Wittgenstein's Tractus or Michel Foucault in their entirety, because a lot of it is winding self-contradictory nonsense. It's a lot better to get the very basic idea of what their approach is, because these are essentially tools. And then when you understand the tool and its practical effects, then you can counter it. There's no sense giving a philosophical response because they rejected logic 100 years ago. There are logical philosophers and logic professors out there who outright reject the law of non-contradiction. It's not reasoned at all. Yeah, okay, I've just read that. Do you think traditional Catholics are getting a little too close to white nationalism and Donald Trump? Yes. Yes, definitely. We are in the world, but we are not of it. We are not to have political opinions. But we have to talk about errors when they pop up. Being politics is of the world. The ideas themselves aren't, particularly when you look at the left, because the modern left with these views, and also the modern right, because they're increasingly adopting this kind of postmodernism, it's fundamentally a hobble religion, and it should be responded to as such, because these kinds of errors lead people to perdition. Should we focus on theory first or praxis first? There needs to be more doing, I think. So praxis. The undercurrent of black thought is rooted in the conflict of thinking of Booker T politics contra Dubois. Dubois as in the Haitian guy, and Garvey, the black intelligentsia, has been under the sway of Dubois and Garvey. I wish that were the case, but in reality they're more under the influence of white post-structuralists. Now, like, Dubois, if I remember correctly, was a representative in the Estates General for Haiti in the 1790s, right? Which is, well, very, very violent time in the history of Haiti, as if there hasn't been as if there's been a non-violent time in the history of Haiti. But at the same time, Dubois was closer to reason than the white philosophers they're taking influence from now. Thoughts on that statue in Bristol that got pulled down? I prefer not to think about it, and I also don't particularly I don't like the fact that the Black Lives Matter people decided to climb the cenotaph, which is the main war memorial in Britain, and try to burn the flag, because my great-grandfather died fighting for that flag. And I understand that perhaps some of them are trying to provoke, and I see a lot of white people fall for this. They're trying to provoke race hatred from white people so they can justify themselves more. Which is gross, because there are a lot of white people that fall for that. So I'm not going to get angry about it. There's no sense in me getting angry about it. Particularly since the country kind of deserves this, right? The only thing that makes the West so good is that it resembles God more than the rest of the world, because we had Catholicism for longer. And we've abandoned God, and so we're losing the beauty, right? We've got these big steel and glass monstrosities amidst beautiful architecture, just to represent the decay. And, of course, people are going to want to attack and destroy the past that resembles God in a greater sense than the modern architecture created by atheistic architects, right? Like, if they want to destroy how much their country resembles its Christian past, then, you know, that's fine, but they're going to get a response at some point, and they're not going to like it. I'd rather just make this country more Christian. The system is impenetrable. Actually, that was one thing I was going to talk about. 3 solutions. What is to be done? I completely forgot this because I got dragged out. Now, so far as I understand, there are 3 approaches that we can have to this whole mass manipulation of the Western mind. Oh, he's talking about W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay, my mistake. I was thinking of the one that was the representative in the Estates General in the 1790s, like I said. We have 3 responses. We can tune it out entirely. We can take the Benedict option. We can run from it. Let the society burn down, which isn't the Christian way. You don't run from your problems, you fix them. It's also tremendously cowardly. But on the other hand, you know, you save your own skin for the 50 years you've got left to live. You know, man lives 70 years, 80 for those who are strong. We could rewire these stereotypes into more healthy things. Like, for example, I was talking to a priest about potentially writing a knockoff of Harry Potter, but with actual character development, where Harry Potter does things wrong and then repents. That would be one way of doing it. You could you could play a similar sort of game to these these mass manipulators, but rewire them into things that are sane. That is a potential approach that I very strongly considered. And the final one is to add more stereotypes, add more of these axioms. Now, I don't think we're in a position to do that because there's 6,200 people on the YouTube channel and maybe a few hundred people active on Discord. We don't have the sort of grunt necessary to do that, at least on a grand scale. Although, we could meme it. I don't think that this approach will work. There's probably a bunch of other ways, but I can't think of any. In fact, I leave that open to you. I leave it open to you to figure out solutions given the framework that I presented. What's your opinion on Vox Day? Don't really have one. Isidore. The nuclear family structure inherently, or the modern nuclear family with a picket fence, mind your historical family structures. There wasn't really a nuclear family before maybe 1800, if I remember correctly. I mean, mother, father, and children. Without the context of a wider family that's that powerful. Thoughts on Steve Bannon? Well, his declaration of a puppet state to oppose China the other day was a very strange one. He also takes a lot of influence from Gnostic philosophers, which seems to contradict his Catholic faith. But I can't tell you what's going on in the man's mind, and it's not my place to judge. Best ways to convert people: by sinning less. In terms of what we can do, I was thinking maybe we can focus on religious people and spread our opinions, but I think it is just wrong to use a religious organisation to spread. You see, I've been thinking about what I can do. And I actually have no idea. I think a lot of these people are so locked in the memes, so locked in these stereotypes by their own choice, that you can't really do anything for them. You can't force someone's will. And I think that most people are not interested in the kind of difficult life of acquiring virtue that is inherent to true Christianity. I think that there's a lot who would like that, though. I think that there's definitely a lot of people who are interested in that, but I don't think the majority are. So truth be told, I think the best way that you can convince someone to do something difficult is to do that difficult thing yourself, and then when they see it isn't so bad, they'll follow you. Because we're not in a position to inculcate in the same way that the state does. Viral Journey asks, as a British Catholic, what's your opinion on the British history since Henry VIII and Britain left the church? Well, I mean, the Anglican Church is state apparatus. You're asking me an incredibly large question. That would take hours to unpack. Please leave the pagan Roman Church. I'm sorry, Nick G. You need to read up on where your Bible came from. Should we promote the creation of organisations that will help spread our political opinion? Don't bother with political opinion. Don't bother with political opinion because, like I say, the world is passing. Try and convert people. Thoughts on Alexander Dugin? He didn't really create a fourth political ideology, he just made another third position one. Right. Let's see how long we've been going for. Right. I'm going to be back in a second. I'm just going to go grab some water. If you guys want to ask more questions, I'm going to come back and answer questions for another 10 minutes, okay? Be back in a sec. Right, fellas, I've just had a thought. Why not, instead of saying Black Lives Matter, why not say Black Lives Do Matter? Because it means the same thing, but you're not appealing to the same... You're not appealing to the same connotations as the About page would make you think. Nick G, you don't know where the Bible came from. I'm sorry. Go and read the go and read the works of Pope Saint Eusebius, Pope Saint Eusebius with Saint Jerome, and you'll know where the modern Western canon comes from, amongst other places. Thoughts on Justin Trudeau recently? He looks a bit bitter and sad. I think he was very clever in his speech. I think keeping his mouth shut for 20 seconds and then saying what was fundamentally a platitude pleased both sides, and also didn't mean that Trump turned around and had him. I actually quite respect how he behaved surrounding all these riots, because he kind of balanced both sides. Do you think that Richard Dawkins will ever convert? I can't read the future. What's your honest opinion on the Society of St. Pius X? Now, there's varying opinions on this, but I have a couple of PDFs that essentially say that they are less canonically licit than the Eastern Orthodox. They're bad. I think, from what I understand, the only thing they can really offer is confession. But I'm of course no canon law expert. Also, it's important to remember that the canon law in itself isn't infallible. The ordinary magisterium is infallible, which consists of the scriptures, the ecumenical councils. What else was there? It consisted of? It's the scriptures, the ecumenical councils, the unified consensus of the fathers, which are those teachers who preceded the Great Schism, I believe. Although the thing is that consensus of the fathers canon came from the Second Council of Constantinople, and that was held in the 6th century. And then there was one other one that I can't actually remember. It wasn't encyclicals. Encyclicals aren't infallible. The canon law itself isn't infallible. If Pope Francis wanted to, he could get rid of the code of canon law right now. The 1983 one, and reformulate one. He just couldn't do it. He just couldn't do it without it being based on the ordinary magisterium. But I am no expert at all on this matter. At all. Let's see. The problem we are facing is that, unlike the left, I do not think that the organisations we create will promote revolution. We don't want revolution. We don't want revolution. You know what I want? I just want to grill. I want to go to church, have my sacraments, get married, have children, and not be constantly assaulted by insanity. That's essentially all I want. I don't care for having some based dictatorship or some based political regime. I care about having taxes sufficiently low that I could take care of my family in a nice way. I care about having laws that restrict obscenity and subversion. And I am interested in the unborn preventing the murder of the unborn and offences against the natural law. That's what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in monarchy per se. I'm not interested in republics per se. I'm interested in something that works. River suggests Black Lives Matter too. Yeah, you could do that. You could go Black Lives Do Matter, but anything that breaks the meme-plex, anything that breaks the stereotype that's instilled in the mind behind that hashtag is perfect. But it still conveys the inherent meaning, because the inherent meaning that most people think is not bad. In fact, it is supremely good. You just need to unpack the nonsense. What do you think is the future of Christianity in the West? Do you expect a resurgence, or do you think that it will be a minority religion? I think there'll be more and more people going to heaven. That's what I think. And that's how I'll leave it, because I don't actually know. Also, canon law falls under the arms of the Pope. Using canon law to justify disobedience against the Church is like using the Bible to justify... Yeah, exactly. Citing... This is something that Sades do, right? They'll cite the... I don't know, the canons or the canon law from 1917, and then they'll try and justify that's why the Pope bad. But the canon law of 1917 is not infallible. Likewise, none of the catechisms are fallible. And in fact, a large chunk of the ecumenical councils themselves aren't infallible. A lot of them are disciplines. For instance, receiving communion on the tongue is a discipline. Communion on the hand is just fine. In fact, Pope Paul VI wrote a encyclical enabling it. Now, Pope St. Paul VI did actually say, you know, it's more reverent to receive on the tongue, but the hand is being allowed because it's just a developing practice, right? That may well be true. I can't determine that myself. I don't know. It may well have been. It certainly was in the 1960s, but now it's a bit different, right? But there's a distinction between that and actual dogma, an actual theological truth. For instance, Nicaea stating that Rome has primacy, or the divinity of Christ in the Council of Nicaea. Those things are binding forever. They are infallible statements by these ecumenical councils. What do you think of Taylor Marshall? I heard he's getting involved with InfoWars. I wouldn't watch his stuff. That's what I'll say. You just can't grow without a dictatorship to crush all the organs of propaganda. The thing is that these rules of propaganda that I've been talking about, these have always existed. They've been writings for thousands of years on these things, and they aren't innately bad. It's just they're being used by people who actually don't understand reality. And because they don't understand reality, but they understand these tools, they're exceptionally destructive. Edward Bernays is an exceptionally destructive force. You can't have a family without money. You can't have money unless you toe the party line. Okay, yeah, do tell that to E. Michael Jones. Do tell that to Alex Jones. Tell that to like huge numbers of manual labourers in the South who, while they're poor, are still able to sustain their families, right? They can never stop you believing something. Unless you let them. Right. I'm going to check Discord to see if there are any questions. If you have any final questions, now is the time to post them. Isidore just says, I just want to grill. Well, yeah, I do literally just want to grill. Is a second American Civil War possible? Yes, obviously. Anything is possible, essentially. Except for, the invalidation of God's truth. Because God can't be violated by the world. The only thing that can't change is God. So, there could be an American Civil War. There could be a party down your street where they blare, I don't know, the Third Symphony of Beethoven. There could be, I don't know, your hot dog could be made of adamantine or whatever. Or whatever you want to call adamantine. There's nothing really stopping that. How did the church keep degenerate propaganda in check? Yeah, they had this thing called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. Which, Index Librorum Prohibitorum. I'm not rolling my R's properly. And it was basically a collection of books that prohibited people... Well, it was a collection of books that were prohibited on pain of mortal sin. That's not in force now, though. I think actually one of the best projects that people could do is if they could establish a similar thing for movies and music, which wasn't under the binding of mortal sin, but, you know, provided a good layout so good families can, you know, search through it and find stuff that's going to influence their children or themselves badly, right? Because Protestants do a similar thing, but they're not quite so attuned to theological truth because they're all over the place. I know there are Protestant family groups that do that for films with like sex scenes or whatever, but it doesn't work as well as if you have somebody who's actually acknowledging the theological points and plot points. But they can't really do that. Unless you've got like a really hardcore like Presbyterian, in which case they could just compare against the Institutes of Christian Religion or something like that and do that. But there's not very many Protestant theologians. Have I actually read Harry Potter? Yes, I did. And I found it boring when I was 10, too. Why is that not enforced? Because I presume it was because there were so many books coming out in the 1960s that it was impractical to keep it in force. I think. It was even becoming a problem in the earlier part of the century. For example, Jacques Maritain tried to get René Ganon's books on there, and it didn't end up working, although they really should have been on there. Is Lana Del Rey acceptable to Catholics? I don't know. What I will say is that most popular music isn't good because it deliberately preys on people's emotions and tries to drag them down. It's innately eroticized, not necessarily sexualized, but it's eroticized because it drags people down to a primal emotion, and that's not a good thing for contemplation. My apologies. Let me just see these final questions. What do I think of Judeo-Christian values? I think it's applicable to some things. Do you have an idea on how we can keep degenerate propaganda in check in future? Also, do we need an organisation? Yeah, I do think we do need an organisation. I've already said. I am here late, so sorry, but it was covered. Could you draw a distinction between modern race theory and historical tribalism? They are incredibly difficult things, yeah. I mean, tribalism is literally just, you know, we have like a set of innate similarities that's bind together, right? It's important to remember that ethnicity and race are not the same thing, though, because ethnicity is a far more complex thing than purely genetics and purely phenotype. Whereas modern race theory is Marxist insanity. Right. Okay, so we're gonna bring this to a close. Been going for quite a long time. I'm thinking that I might do a stream particularly on media and things to avoid. Actually, this is an interesting question. What are your thoughts on the confessional Protestants that hold the Book of Concord or the Westminster Confession? The Westminster Confession is very weird. I don't like penal substitution. I think it's a ridiculous belief because it assumes that God the Father can punish God the Son even though he did nothing wrong, which is unjust. Anyway, I'm going to bring this to a close. See you guys. Thanks for watching.